Hello, and thanks for attending the State Historical Society of Iowa's second virtual session of Iowa Stories. My name is Allison Johnson, and I work here at the Historical Society as a cataloger and as a reference librarian. Before we start, I want to thank my fellow staff at the State Historical Society of Iowa and Iowa City for their work behind the scenes to facilitate this presentation. Thanks to Hang Wen, Charles Scott, Anu Tawari, and Mary Bennett. This presentation is set to run an hour and 15 minutes. Our presenter will speak for a little under an hour, and then we will move on to a moderated 10 to 15-minute question and answer session. If you need to leave early for any time, please feel free to do so. This will be recorded if you'd like to watch it later, or if you'd like to share it with someone else. Your microphone will be muted until the Q&A, or you can type questions into the chat as well. Our next virtual lecture will be on November 19th. Our presentation today is by Dr. Shana Stuart. Shana Stuart has a PhD in art history from the University of Kansas and earned her MLIS from the University of Iowa, where she also worked as an adjunct instructor. She has been working on the Carnegie Library project in Iowa project, or CLIP, since 2001 and served as its director since 2004. The Carnegie Libraries in Iowa project is an interdisciplinary endeavor that seeks to chart the history of Iowa's Carnegie Libraries by creating a digital library of images and other documentary and statistical information. CLIP represents a partnership among staff, students, and faculty at the University of Iowa's School of Library and Information Science, University of Iowa Libraries, Iowa library practitioners, and members of Iowa communities. CLIP seeks to document the history and changes in Iowa's Carnegie Libraries by scanning each library's collection of archival materials. As materials are collected and made available in a database record for each community, it will be possible to more completely study and understand the history of Iowa's Carnegie Libraries in the context of their evolving communities. One of the best aspects of this project comes from assisting and encouraging communities across Iowa to dig into their own history of their own Carnegie Library and how it fits into the community history. Please please join me in welcoming Shana.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the State Historical Society of Iowa for this opportunity to share a little of the history of Iowa's Carnegie Libraries. And I would also like to thank the State Historical Society Incorporated of Iowa, which has provided funding that has allowed our archival collection to grow from a little over 100 original images to more than 13,000 photographs, blueprints, board meeting minutes, letters, canceled checks, and all kinds of other archival materials. I also want to thank all those who have supported this project, the students who have worked on it, the librarians across the state that have contributed the materials, and those who have personally supported me in this endeavor. I am wearing, but maybe it's not visible here, a Carnegie button that my youngest made for me about 8 years ago. So you know that I'm a little bit of a Carnegie geek. My children grew up going on Carnegie trips across the state. Well, Carnegie was often called Saint Andy, the patron saint of libraries. He was also a flawed man who made some poor decisions along the way. However, I would challenge you to find too many other people who worked to give away 90% of their wealth to the benefit of people around the world. Apparently, Andy was a very enjoyable individual and a man who impacted so many in Iowa. So what you are looking at is an artistic rendering, an architectural drawing of the proposed building for the Iowa City Library in 1902. In March of 1902, the mayor of Iowa City, F.K. Stebbins, received a letter from Andrew Carnegie's secretary, which was dated March 14th. The letter announced the gift of $25,000 for the city to erect a free public library. It is interesting to note that Iowa City was one of 7 communities that received letters from Bertram that were dated March 14th. And counting alphabetically, it meant that Iowa City received the 18th grant in the state from Carnegie. These buildings, of which there are 101 in the state, stand as a testament, I believe, to Iowans' hard work and perseverance, because often the communication styles and the understanding of the process necessary to get this funding were as unclear to the communities. These buildings often also stand as a testament to Iowans' appreciation of knowledge, as they were the ones who had to provide the resources, the books, the magazines, the other materials, to fill the shelves in these buildings. And these buildings also show a dedication and investment in the towns by the communities who were willing to provide these important amenities. Cities additionally worked to acquire or provide larger plots of land so that the libraries appeared to be situated in park-like settings, which heightened their unique position in their communities. That is a legacy of the City Beautiful movement out of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And I would encourage you in every picture that I'm showing to take note of the grass area around all of the buildings. But there were also risks involved in this process. Carnegie took risks by giving grants to small towns, as there were no guarantees that the towns would continue to thrive and grow. Communities were also required to take risks on their buildings because they were forced to accept the lowest bidders for the construction. It is remarkable that most of these buildings have survived their century plus of existence and today continue as the most visible reminder of Carnegie's riches in Iowa. I've selected this portrait of Andrew Carnegie because it is very similar to the image of him that was gifted to all Carnegie libraries across the United States on the centennial of his death in 1935. When pictures were taken of him indoors, he is most often shown with books. Here he is in his library with books around him and behind him and even under his hand. You see, he is looking up to interact with us, the viewer. He wanted to make clear that he was a man of learning, despite his working man's background. He was proud to be a published author, and he frequently quoted Shakespeare in his correspondence. Andrew Carnegie was born in 1835 in Dunfermline, Scotland. His father was a damask weaver who was put out of business by the steam revolution. So the family of four, Carnegie had a younger brother, Tom, immigrated to the Pittsburgh area in 1848. He was 13 at that time and had had only 5 years of schooling because he had not wanted to start school at the age of 5 and instead held it off until the time he was 8 because he already knew how to read, write, and to do math. So his parents had not forced him. Once in Pittsburgh, he started to work as a bobbin boy, a position he hated. He then became a telegraph messenger, and as a working boy, he was allowed on Saturdays to utilize the private library of Colonel James Anderson. Carnegie was always grateful for that opportunity. He was bright and sociable, and he became a telegraph operator, reputedly the third person that could translate the telegraph by sound. And then he came to the attention of Mr. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Under Scott, Carnegie became an assistant manager and then the manager of the railroad, working there from 1853 to 1865. He served the United States during the Civil War, working on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he was also involved in the creation of the U.S. military Telegraph Corps during the Civil War. That will come up later. After the war, he got out of running the railroad and began supplying the needs of the growing railroads across the country. He was involved in making rails out of iron. He had an interest in a locomotive business, and he started the Keystone Bridge Company, which built iron bridges. So when I began working on this project, the assumption was that Carnegie had never been probably much west of the Pittsburgh area, since most of his living time was associated with Pittsburgh and New York. However, it was the sales of these rails and bridges that brought Carnegie to Iowa. In 1868, he was in Dubuque, where he convinced the community to work with his company and build a wrought iron bridge, as opposed to his competitor who was trying to sell them a cast iron bridge. He noted in his writings that he enjoyed the charms of the city. He was also in Davenport. He became good friends with Alice French, who became the writer Octave Thanet, who accompanied him on an 1881 return trip to Scotland with his mother and a whole coaching party. French was nicknamed the stewardess in his writings on the trip. It is in his account of that trip, entitled An American Four in Hand of 1883, that Carnegie provided the fish story, which makes somewhat of our connection to the last talk in this series. And the fish story demonstrates that he moved beyond the eastern borders of the state. So ultimately, he probably passed through the state many times, as in those days, it was not flyover territory between the coasts, but ride through country on the rails. And I know that he went several times to California. So in 1881, at the age of 46, Carnegie claimed that one of his most memorable events occurred in Iowa. This was a man who had already traveled around the world, but he wrote that one of his most thrilling sensations in life was being drawn over Spirit Lake in Iowa in his skiff for a half an hour by a monster pickerel. So you know that the fishing in Iowa was good even then. In the 1870s, Carnegie began the Carnegie Steel Company, and essentially he cornered the market. After his mother and brother died in 1887, at the age of 52, Carnegie married Louise Whitfield, and in 1897, they had a daughter, Margaret. Her birth prompted them to buy the Castle of Skibo in the Scottish Highlands, where they spent almost every summer, and to build their mansion on Fifth Avenue in New York City, which is now the Cooper Hewitt Museum. In 1901, Carnegie sold Carnegie Steel for over $10 trillion in 2019 figures, and he was congratulated by J.P. Morgan as being the richest man in the world. In 1911, he created the Carnegie Corporation of New York because he could not get rid of his wealth fast enough. The corporation still exists and still provides funding for research and education. His funding has also provided countless benefits to people across the country. It was the genesis of the TIAA funding. He created the Carnegie Hero Fund Trust, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and ultimately his funding led to the creation of Sesame Street. He died in 1919, in part crushed by the fact that World War I destroyed his idea that all grows better. So he became interested in giving money for libraries because of his experience with Colonel Anderson, and he focused primarily on that task. He said, "I choose free libraries as the best agencies for improving the masses of the people because they give nothing for nothing. They only help those who help themselves. They never pauperize. They reach the aspiring and open to them the chief treasures of the world, those stored up in books." On March 30th, 1901, Harper's Weekly Magazine, which is the equivalent of Time or Newsweek today, maybe, had this image on their front cover. It shows Carnegie in the center, building a structure composed of individual libraries with the fires of his steel mills, in the background. The caption states, "Building a very solid temple of fame." But Carnegie made no requirements that his name be placed on the front of these buildings. It is also interesting to note that in the depiction, the artist has not chosen cookie cutter reproductions but instead is acknowledging that there is a great variety of looks among the buildings, the libraries that were being built. Carnegie gave his first library grant in 1881 on that trip that was previously referenced to his hometown of Dunfermline, Scotland. In 1886, he gave his first US grant to the city of Allegheny, Pennsylvania. In 1899, he gave $5 million to New York City for 66 buildings, a gift that astonished the nation. Despite the fact that there was no formal name or announcement for his library program, it was clear by March of 1901 that his gift giving was well underway. He divided his giving into two periods. The first he called the retail period, which covered the time from 1886 to 1897 and included 14 buildings given to 6 communities. 4 of those communities were in the Pittsburgh area. 1 was to Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and 1 was for a library in Fairfield, Iowa. The first outside of his hometown areas of Pittsburgh and Johnstown, and the first west of the Mississippi. During his wholesale period, Carnegie gave grants to 1,406 communities across the United States. Worldwide, he gave libraries to over 50 other communities, which were all parts of the British Empire. So here is the depiction of Fairfield, that first grant that Iowa received. In 1892, they received an initial grant for $30,000, which was soon increased to $40,000. And it is interesting to note that this library was initially not a free public library, nor is the library building typical arrangement for subsequent Carnegie buildings. The grant came about because of the personal relationship between an Iowa senator, James F. Wilson, who hopped on the train in DC to visit Carnegie in New York City. Fairfield's grant was also an anomaly because it was not accompanied with the ultimate requirement to support the library annually at 10% of the gift. Fairfield's gift set the stage for the 104 gifts for public libraries that were received in the state, which placed Iowa 4th on the list of state recipients. However, while 104 communities pursued gifts, ultimately only 99 communities accepted their gifts, and 2 of those communities received grants for 2 buildings, which explains the 101 buildings that were built. Owine was one of the 5 communities to reject the gift and did so on the grounds of Carnegie's tainted money. Additionally, there were 8 colleges in the state which received funding for an academic library, which means that Iowa is tied for 2nd place for the number of academic libraries gifted. Pennsylvania received 9, while Iowa and Ohio received 8 each, although only 7 of Iowa's institutions utilized their grants. So here is the image of Corydon, which was the last grant in the state, and they received $8,000. These later grants were generally smaller, which was a reaction by Carnegie to the architectural excesses of many of the early grants. The 3 largest grants in Iowa were of $75,000 to Davenport in 1899, to Cedar Rapids in 1901, and to Sioux City in 1911. There were also 4 grants for over $70,000. The smallest grant in the state was to Lorenz in 1907 for $3,800, but they were able to build a stucco building that still exists today, although it does not serve as the library. The average grant in the state was for $10,000, and there were 36 communities that received that amount. Additionally, there were 35 communities that were able to negotiate for an increase of their original grant. So across the state, there were 66 grants for county seats, There were 17 counties which received at least 2 grants, and Harrison County on the western side of the state received 4 grants for Dunlap, Logan, Missouri Valley, and Woodbine. And there were 22 counties which never pursued a grant, in part because many of them felt comfortable with their library building. Today, 48 of the buildings are still libraries. 45 no longer serve as libraries, and 8 public and 2 academic buildings have been removed. So this is James Bertram, a fellow Scotsman who served as the personal secretary of Carnegie and administered the library gifts between 1897 and 1914 as Carnegie's secretary, and then from 1914 until 1917, since he was serving as the secretary of the Carnegie Corporation, which he did then until his death in 1934. He was the individual who dealt with all of the communities, and many times he was quite a frustrating individual to deal with, I think. First, he utilized simplified spelling, which was a movement that Carnegie was financially supporting. It has been interesting for me to see the contrast between all of these communities that are making their cases for the need for a library building as a reflection of their interest in the education and learning. And then they receive a letter from Bertram with oddly spelled words. You can see an example of his spelling in the third quote on the slide. Bertram was also a very brusque individual in his correspondence, which might have been a reflection of the hundreds of letters he was typing out. And I think we have to think about the fact that he was using a manual typewriter and pounding out hundreds and hundreds of letters. But it would not be unusual for a community to be struggling with some issue in their quest for the gift. They would write asking for clarification, and his response would typically be, "See previous letter." This is why I think many of the grants are a testament to Iowans' perseverance, because they had to keep writing and to keep working to understand when Bertram sent very brief responses to their inquiries. So one of the fun things that I've discovered along the way is how quickly this correspondence between Bertram and the communities was taking place. I'm showing you 2 pages from Margaret Weiss Brown's book, The 7 Little Postmen, because I think they make it clear how it was possible to have such a rapid turnaround. In the left-hand picture, you can see the little train man hanging out the open door with his hook, ready to grab the mail bag as the train passed through the towns. The scene on the right shows how the mail was sorted in transit, which allows for the incredibly fast turnaround. It was quite common for these letters to reflect a 2 or 3 day turnaround. Of course, in looking at Iowa City's materials, they don't have any examples of that turnaround. Most of their letters are 4 days apart, nor does Waterloo, which is the next slide that I'll be showing you. However, Sheraton, which is also be coming up here, does have an example of that 2-day exchange. So the letter Bertram sent to Sheraton announcing their gift was dated on January 13th, 1903. The thank you note back from Sheraton was dated January 15th, 1903. Isn't it interesting that the mail was so efficient and timely in the early 1900s? Bertram usually just conveyed Mr. Carnegie's generic involvement in the grant process. However, the situation in Waterloo was one in which Bertram conveyed more of Carnegie's commentary. So on April 11th, 1902, Bertram had sent a letter to Waterloo indicating that the city would receive $30,000 for a library building. Then, for the next 2 years, Bertram received correspondence which documented the city's inability to decide where to build the library, as it was hotly contested by both sides of the Cedar River. By October 1903, so a year and a half later, it was proposed to build the library on a bridge joining the 2 sides. In a letter dated January of 1904, Bertram noted, Mr. Carnegie knows that more good would result if there were two libraries, one on each side of the river, and even if it required a few $1,000s more, he would be glad to give it. A few weeks later, Bertram noted that Carnegie would increase his gift to $40,000, and he noted that Carnegie was reminded of Lincoln's story, Abraham Lincoln, showing the undesirability of changing horses in the middle of a stream, and he rejoices that Waterloo has made such a good swap. By November of 1905, Carnegie had increased his gift again to $45,000 after Waterloo's request for an additional $5,000. The ease with which Waterloo negotiated their increases was somewhat of an anomaly for many communities. While Bertram impacted the process on the national level, many Iowa communities were also impacted by Alice Sarah Tyler. Tyler served as the secretary of the Iowa Library Commission from its inception in 1900 until 1913, when she moved to take a position ultimately as the director of the Library School of Western Reserve University in Ohio. Tyler, interestingly, was not a supporter of Carnegie money because, as seen by the Fairfield building, communities saw the buildings as a statement, not solely as efficient enclosures for their collection of books. Her reservations were surely noted around the state, and consequently, she was not always included in the negotiations for community gifts, although she was very helpful in guiding communities through the process of procuring tax support for their libraries. Tyler's other major objection regarding the gifts was that she believed that it would limit the future support of the libraries to the 10% that Carnegie stipulated. She was probably correct in many cases. The annual support would have included funds for janitorial expenses and maintenance expenses, funds for the growth of the collection, which might not have grown quickly enough, and funds for the librarian's salary. The practicalities meant that women were generally not paid a wage that allowed them to live independently in their communities, and collection sizes were often stunted by the lack of gifts or funds. However, she personally wrote a letter of support for the Sheraton Carnegie in 1902, and in 1913, she wrote in support to Bertram in support of more funding for Cresco's gift. She occasionally served as a consultant on the plans for the buildings, and she frequently spoke at the dedication ceremonies for the buildings. Despite her reservations, Tyler had close connections to the Carnegie-funded library in Sheraton. Sheraton's grant, dated from January 13, the example I just given you, in 1903, which made it the 28th grant in the state. Tyler wrote 2 letters of support for the acquisition of the grant, and she spoke at the dedication of the building in October 1904, all of which fell within her role as secretary of the Iowa Library Commission. Her connection with Sheraton came because she had met Sheraton's librarian, Margaret Brown, and then hired her to come and work with her in Des Moines. And the 2 women lived together until ill health caused Brown to leave her position in 1912. At the Sheraton dedication in 1904, Tyler gave the library 3 pictures, one of the Roman Forum, one of the Roman Colosseum, and one of the Arch of Constantine that she had acquired in Rome that summer. Tyler also published the floor plan for Sheraton as an example of a model plan. The plan shows that there were 2 equal reading rooms on the main floor on either side of the charging desk, and that in this plan, there is a fireplace in the children's room. It was common in these early libraries to have fireplaces, usually in each of the general reading room and the children's library, but often if it was only one, oddly enough, it was in the children's reading room. I'll also direct your attention to the small sink, which shows up as the small circle behind the fireplace, where children were expected to wash their hands before using the materials. and it was fairly standard to have the librarian's office off of the children's room. The preferred plan included a rectangular area for the stacks, which would more easily allow for additions to the space. In contrast, Iowa City had a semicircular stack area, which was not considered as flexible. The basement in this plan and for these libraries included a workroom and restrooms, as well as an assembly room or lecture room, which had access from the outside so that evening programs could be held. As collection sizes increased, the children were moved down into that basement space. A more recent trend in libraries has been to emphasize the need for community space. It turns out it's not new. This is a return to the space needs provided by the Carnegie buildings. So here, let's return to this image of Iowa City's building as it was built, as we look at the elements that were incumbent upon communities to provide before Bertram signed off on their funding. There were three expectations. The first was that the community would establish their need for outside funding. Across Iowa, this took shape in many different ways. There were communities that wrote saying that they had too many saloons in town. There were other communities that wrote that they had no saloons in town. In any case, they were trying to make the point that they needed a library to provide something for individuals to do. The second expectation was that there would be a city resolution which stated that the library would be supported by tax money at 10% of the grant. And the third was that a suitable lot for the site would be provided. In many communities, lots were donated or the city bought the lot. So Iowa City's case began in 1901. The board of directors had sent a letter to Carnegie making their case for the need for funding and saying that they could support a library at over $3,500 a year. Their idea was that if they told him how much support they could provide, that he would give them a corresponding grant. Unfortunately, they had no response to that letter because Carnegie was in Scotland. So they enlisted the aid of Iowa's senior senator, William B. Allison, who wrote Carnegie in January of 1902. It's his portrait that you see here, and this is the portrait that hangs in the US Senate building. In a letter dated in March of 1902, Bertram sent a letter to Iowa City stating that they would get $25,000. 10 days later, they had voted to support the library at $2,500, so that 10%. So their process worked fairly easily. As detailed in Lolly Egger's history of the Iowa City Library, the board began to search for a suitable lot, which turned out to be more contentious and costly than had been hoped for. However, the issue was resolved by the end of May. And again, contrast that with Waterloo, which took over 2.5 years. And by July of 1902, the board of directors had chosen an architectural firm from Des Moines. And the architect wrote Bertram and said that they did not believe that $25,000 would be enough to build a suitable building for the community. So in July of 1902, again, several months after this process had first officially started, there was an individual in Iowa City who had been a board member, and his name was Judge M.J. Wade. He'd been a district judge, a board member in Iowa City, and then in 1902, he was elected to the US House of Representatives. So he wrote again to Carnegie asking for more funds. and the letter went dormant because Carnegie was again in Scotland. In December of 1902, Wade wrote a second time. Bertram responded at the end of December and said, "Inasmuch as the usual sum allowed for library buildings, a city of the size of yours, is about 17,500, and you have been allowed 25,000, Mr. Carnegie does not see his way to give any consideration to the request to increase it." In March of 1903, in a letter to Senator Allison, Wade wrote, "It would be a great favor to the people of this community if you could personally call Mr. Carnegie's attention to the situation." And on April 10th of 1903, so a month later, Bertram wrote to Wade, "Mr. Carnegie desires me to say that if a pledge is received from Iowa City that $3,500 a year will be appropriated and spent on the library, he will increase his allowance for the building to $35,000. The apparent factor in that increase was the influence of William Boyd Allison. Allison had been born, I believe, in Ohio, and he had come to the state, to Dubuque, by 1860. And from 1863 to 1873, he served in the U.S. House. And then from 1873 until his death in 1908, he served as an Iowa senator. He was an influential leader in the Senate and probably is depicted holding one of the many bills he sponsored. In this portrait, he was clearly acquainted with Carnegie. His involvement with Iowa City's request for funding was at least his fourth intervention in the state. Previously, he had helped Dubuque, Cedar Falls, and Hampton in their pursuit of funds. However, it should be noted that while communities utilized these contacts, there were many more Iowa communities that pursued their funding without them and were equally successful, even in getting increases. Recently, I came upon the published address for the main Carnegie Library in Washington, D.C., which was dedicated on January 7th, 1903, with Carnegie and President Theodore Roosevelt addressing the attendees, which must have included the who's who in Washington. In the biography section on Carnegie, a list of some of the gifts he had given in 1902 was provided. 46 libraries were listed out of the 129 total grants he had given in 1902, and 6 of those that were listed were from Iowa, the highest number for a single state. The list caught my eye in particular as Iowa City was listed with a grant of $25,000, and directly underneath it in the list was Lawrence, Kansas, my hometown, with $25,000. I find that this comparison is a telling example of how maybe a little more of Mr. Carnegie's riches made their way into Iowa. This can best be seen in the comparison of these two communities, which were both growing university towns on the prairie. It is important to note that while Carnegie's gifts were calculated at about $2 per capita on the basis of population, the initial gifts to the two communities were the same, even though Iowa City's 1900 population was a little under 8,000 and Lawrence's was 10,862. In fact, you might remember that Bertram alluded to that discrepancy when he first rejected Iowa City's request for an increase, saying that they should not have even been receiving that initial $25,000. In 1903, Iowa City's gift was increased by $10,000, while in 1904, Lawrence received the $2,500 increase that they had requested. So Iowa City was far more successful in obtaining additional funds. By 1916, Lawrence seems to have outgrown their building and requested $15,000 more for an addition. Bertram, as he did, requested the plans and photos, and his response was quite negative. He criticized the highly ornate and massive entrance feature taking up over 1/3 of the front of the building, and the resulting interior arrangement. In a subsequent letter, Bertram leveled a charge which was never made against Iowa. He said, as the condition of matters in regard to the keeping of pledges in Kansas, pledges given to secure library buildings, has been so unsatisfactory that the Board of Trustees of the corporation have been led to suspend, for the present, the giving of such library buildings or adding to those existing in the state of Kansas. In total, Kansas had received 58 grants, which placed them 8th on the list of grant recipients. In contrast, Iowa continued to receive grants. In 1916, they received 4, and there were 2 more in 1917. So while Lawrence put money into their massive entrance feature, according to Bertram, Iowa City ended up with a look that was clearly influenced by the architecture of the Chicago World Fair in 1893, which also served as the influence for Ottumwa, the 3rd grant in the state. The only existing remainder from the fair was the building which housed the fair's fine arts collection, which is now the Field Museum in Chicago, which is seen on your lower left. Ottumwa echoed the shape of the copper dome, the Ionic capitals, and the sense of the colonnade across the front of their building. Iowa City's dome is hidden beneath the temple front, or behind the temple front, but the 4 Ionic columns and the decorated frieze would seem to be a direct reference. While many of the buildings across Iowa employed the same classical architecture, I want to briefly give you a sense that not all Carnegie libraries look the same, although there are others across the country that share these same characteristics. There were 3 libraries in Iowa that were built with corner entrances. The buildings were symmetrical on either side of the entrance, but it gives a slightly different look. On the top, you have Marshalltown in 1901, a fairly large grant, and Eagle Grove in 1902. And they reference the classical look of the fair, although Eagle Grove had to translate the cut stone into brick. And then Britt, which was a very late grant in 1916, it was the 95th grant in the state, had to translate that classical look also into the cheaper medium of brick because they received less. Another style that was utilized by communities across the state was the English Tudor or Gothic style. And here are 3 that show some of that range. Red Oak in 1906 at the top shows a steep roof and timber accents. Audubon in the lower left features a slightly pointed arch in their windows and a gable over their entrance. And Bloomfield in 1911 selected a cottage look with steep roof and exposed timbers. The Prairie Craftsman style look was another one that was selected by some communities. These are 3 in Iowa that seem to be a hybrid of these styles, which feature lower hipped roofs and strong horizontal accents. Interestingly, though, they all share rounded windows, which was not a feature associated with the Prairie style. Ottawa, up at the top, in 1907, received a $10,000 grant from Carnegie, and that was supplemented by another $10,000 from a local donor, so they were able to build a more substantial building. Woodbine in 1909 and Rhinebeck in 1916 were working with a lot less money. My favorites are probably the eclectics, where the communities ended up with an array of architectural details. Iowa Falls, up in the top left in 1903, is the most exuberant example of everything. They have a dome, a classical Roman triumphal arch with a pedimented doorway squashed in there, topped by a fan light surmounted by a bald eagle. Rockwell City in 1908 placed a classical temple front on a rounded Flemish gable. And Emmitsburg in 1911 combined Flemish gables with a small but strongly articulated archway. So I hope you no longer believe that all of Carnegie's look the same. These are two libraries that are both found in Marion County, and again demonstrate how different looks appealed to different communities, even though these communities were fairly close together. And it became clear to me that communities wanted to keep up with the Joneses, but they didn't want to necessarily look like the Joneses. Pella was an early grant in 1905, and they received $10,000 initially plus a $1,000 increase. And they chose a look that is singular in the state. And I've only seen one twin in Biggs, California, which was a 1906 grant for $5,000. Pella's facade features a classical temple front, but it is unique with its non-symmetrical entrance. Knoxville's grant, which was received 5 years later, is interesting because they are the county seat of Marion, and they received less money than Pella did. So I'm including these two because they provide two of the more interesting stories that we've uncovered in our research. Pella was founded by Dutch immigrants, and the land for the library was provided by a first-generation single woman who actually traveled to New York City to try to meet with Carnegie. Although her trip was unsuccessful, it didn't affect the grant. What is most interesting was to discover that the three of the members of the board of directors for the library and the first librarian were from the family of the Dutch founder of Pella, an unusual case of all in the family. Knoxville provides another example of how Carnegie's riches were distributed in Iowa. Knoxville received their grant in 1910, and in August of 1911, the mayor, Cambridge Culbertson, signed a note stating that the board had purchased the lot for the building. In doing some research, I discovered that Culbertson, who served 5 times as mayor of Knoxville, had been a Civil War vet who lost an arm during his service in the Military Telegraph Corps. After the war, Congress did not provide pensions to these men who served in the Corps. But in 1897, after much lobbying, Congress began providing a certificate of honorable service, which entitled the men to a pension that was funded solely by Andrew Carnegie. In January of this past year, I was able to spend 2.5 days frantically wading through the hundreds and hundreds of files of the people that Carnegie supported during his lifetime and even to the ends of their lifetimes. Among many other pensions, Carnegie provided over 100 men of the Telegraph Corps with a monthly stipend of $12. Culbertson, who made no effort to capitalize on his connection with Carnegie and the pursuit of Knoxville money, died in 1926, 7 years after Carnegie, and his widow was still receiving support in 1933. I saw papers that showed support for the widows, and in some cases, the single daughters of these men paid out until the 1940s. It turns out that there were 6 Iowa veterans of the military Telegraph Corps who received these pensions. So we've seen that Carnegie provided monies for public libraries in Iowa to the tune of over $1.5 million. There were academic libraries that brought in $210,000 in pensions for at least 6 Iowans. And then there were pipe organs, and there were 67 churches in the state who received funding for a total of over $65,000 to purchase a pipe organ. And this process was also set up in a very similar fashion to the public libraries. So the churches, the congregations wrote, they had to provide information about the total cost of the pipe organ, and then Carnegie would send funding for half of that amount. There were 4 churches in Iowa City that received money for their pipe organs. The first in Iowa City was the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1907, a building which still stands and still is the church. and you are looking at the dedication program for the laying of the cornerstone. Many of the men who were involved in the procurement of the funds for the public library in Iowa City were also involved here, including Senator Allison. Carnegie provided, as I said, half of the sum for the organ, so this church received $1,875. The other churches in Iowa City included a February 1908 grant for the First Baptist Church for $750, and Senator Allison wrote in support of that application, and a February 1909 grant for the First Unitarian Church for $500, which is located just across from the State Historical Society in Iowa City, and the December 1909 grant to the Christian Church for $750. It's interesting to note that many of these bequests have been forgotten. So I'm ending with the home page of our website. I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide you with a whirlwind tour of the many ways that Carnegie's money impacted Iowa. You've seen about 22, or about a quarter, of Iowa's public libraries, and the screenshot here provides you with information to access the website and explore our information more fully. I'm again grateful to share these fun stories about Iowans, and we're working to continue to explore the communities more deeply. I have individuals across the state who are writing biographies on the board's members of their communities, and I'm always happy to encourage people to contribute to our site and to our research. So I am able to take questions now.
So I think the easiest thing to do is just, if you have a question, to type it into the group chat, and then I'll try to read it, and then Shana can answer. That sounds good. I think the first question we had from Michael Nieder says, was Drake Law School one of the buildings?
Drake, yes, Drake University received a academic grant.
Okay. Okay. Paul Jewell asks, will you speak to the cane of Carnegie's that is in the Tipton Library?
I have seen that cane. I know that it was a personal cane. I have not had the opportunity to do more research about how they came to have it, but clearly Carnegie was known to many Iowans, and he certainly had a fondness for many of them. So I'm not surprised that something like that would end up in the state.
Okay. Carol Ann Vinoy says, are there resources that you were aware of that would be appropriate for grade school students in my class?
There are a couple of biographies on him. I don't think that they are listed on our website under resources because of that level, but I know that there are at least 2 biographies I can think of that would be appropriate for grade school children.
So how could she find those?
Actually, I would look at I know that Iowa City Library, Public Library has them, so you could start by looking at the the card catalog for the Iowa City Library.
Sure, and then just look at kind of the grade level maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Diane asks, is there any information on the Dubuque Library or any Dubuque churches that got organ grants?
Yes, I have been working with the head of the director of the Dubuque Library. We have quite a few of their materials. Everything that we currently have is not visible on the website quite yet because of a technical glitch, but we have many of those materials. They have many of those materials, and hopefully very soon we will be making those materials available. So Dubuque has a fascinating story. We do have their blueprints here on our site.
Oh, okay. I just put the link into the project site. So if anybody didn't have that yet, this is what that Shauna's been talking about.
So if you look at our website, across the top, we have a tab on public libraries. And when you click on that, that will give you a drop down of all of the public libraries in Iowa. And then you can go through and see what we have been able to load onto the site. As I said, we have several thousand materials that are not currently visible, but will hopefully soon be loaded on.
Okay. Shauna, could you stop the screen sharing? I guess it would give us a better shot of you.
Actually, I don't know how to do that.
I don't see any other questions. I guess maybe I was thinking of one. What's maybe the most unusual use you've seen as a former Carnegie Library, like that people are using it for now?
Well, there are a couple of them that have been turned into bars or restaurants.
Okay, wow.
DeWitt and Lake City are two that come to mind. Prior to DeWitt being the restaurant or the bar in town, it had been used as a a private home. So somebody had bought it and refit it to serve as their home, which they did for many years. So
that's cool.
Yes, it always makes me happy that people are able to utilize them and keep the buildings in their communities.
Yeah, I just went to the one in Lorenz maybe 2 years ago, and it's a museum. It's really neat now, but yeah.
And Lorenz, as I'd said, was the smallest grant. And normally what concerned communities was to be able to build a building of stone or brick to make them fireproof. And stucco was a much cheaper option, not quite that, assurance, I guess, is the.
Yeah.
But yes, it's still there.
Jess Runlet was asking if you could talk a little bit about the buildings that have been lost.
Well, so one, despite the fact that it was a brick building, was the Spencer Library, and the town burned and they lost the library. So that's one of them. More recently, they have, the most recent one to come down was Stuart, Iowa, ironically. And they rebuilt on the same site, combined library and city offices. But most of them, Davenport's came down fairly early because they had done an addition to it, and the addition was not as well, the foundation wasn't as secure, so the foundation started to sink and apparently was pulling the building down.
Interesting.
And I want to thank you for this excellent presentation. This is Mary Bennett, and I hope everybody will go to their reaction key and give you a round of applause. We really appreciate, there's a lot of positive feedback coming in on the chat room about your presentation. So let's thank Shana, and we can continue with the questions, but I want to make sure when everybody's here that we're showing our appreciation for this very wonderful talk. It's so interesting, and all your facts and figures were just fascinating. Thank you, Shana.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, does anyone else have any questions or things we want to go over more? Someone said encourage Clinton to keep their library.
I found your website, and I see the libraries thing, but I haven't had time to look. Do you have information on the organs too on that website, or is there a site?
We have not. I have not provided that list. I have been able to create more recently, so I've not updated that. This is like having something close to 120 children that I'm trying to kind of keep track of all of them. And we also do have a little bit of information about some of the other, what I call the Carnegie era libraries from the state, so that they can provide kind of a counterpoint to those communities that weren't interested in going after the Carnegie money. So I've included some of those too. And recently, because of the funding I've been able to have students, and that's allowed me to go out and we're borrowing materials from communities and bring them back and digitize them, which is why we have a little bit of a backlog, because people have been very generous and are very interested in sharing their materials so that we can create this larger database, this digital library of materials.
Wonderful, thank you.
Shana, when you say that people didn't, I guess, want his money or didn't agree with him, or, I mean, how did that usually come about, or how would somebody convince their community to not take a grant like that?
Again, I haven't done a whole lot of research with those individuals just because they're those communities, but somebody in the community apparently corresponded with Carnegie, with Bertram, and was able to procure a grant. And then once they brought it back to the community, then there was dissension about whether or not to accept it. And as Olwine said, they weren't interested because of how he had made his money. The others were hoping that there would be a local donor who would step up and provide that. So that was the case in a couple of those communities. But for whatever reason, I always think that that's one of the most puzzling aspects of this, because it was a free building. And yeah, as you can see, there were very few conditions or stipulations. So to walk away from what was a free building is pretty amazing at that time period.
Yeah.
Me too.
I was amused by Alice's idea that the collections were as important or perhaps more important than the building, because that seems to be a message that even we at the State Historical Society need to convey to people.
Yeah.
Right.
Shana, I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. I'm from one of the communities that has a library that looks a lot like a Carnegie Library, but is not. And that's the Kendall Young Library in Webster City, Iowa.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And it's a gorgeous, the people of Webster City are very proud of that building.
Yes. No, when I first started this, I had gone to a photography exhibit, and it was of Carnegie Libraries, and the Kendall Young in Webster City Library was up there. And I thought, oh, really? I don't think that that's at Carnegie's, so yes. So we do have a spot for Webster City on our website, because that was funded by a local donor, and it is one of the most beautiful buildings in the state from that time period, because they imported marbles and all kinds of elements, because they had those extra funds and that extra attention. So it is a library that we are tracking, or sort of.
I'll add the comment that the Perry, Iowa Carnegie Library is really a virtual museum right now, that you can go in and see the kind of layout that Shana was showing us with that architectural plan, because all of the elements are still intact, and it's very well maintained and restored, of course. But
yes, and they have moved out of that building because, again, it had a circulating or a radiating stack area, which meant that the back of the building was rounded, which does not allow itself to be added onto very easily at all. So yes, that is one of the reasons that Perry moved out of their building.
Shana, how would you recommend that people help you out with stuff that you're missing on the website, or how would you like to receive, if people have things they would like to add that maybe you're lacking on there, that they could help?
We'll start by emailing me.
Okay.
As I said, I have a couple of individuals in the Colfax Newton area who have been writing biographies on these board members. And as I said, when we started doing that, I taught a class and we looked at Marengo, and my students wrote very brief biographies on the people in Marengo. I had another student who did an independent study with me, and he worked on Pella. And that's how we learned that, you know, a third of the board was from the same family. These were men who were listed, and their last names were all different, but they had married the daughters of the Dutch founder. So that was a very interesting piece. So, for example, in Colfax, which was a fairly small grant, the woman who served as the president of the board the entire time was a medical doctor. And so he's written on her. It's also, I didn't bring this out well, but women were quite involved, obviously, in all of this, and women served on these boards of directors. So women in Iowa had the ability to vote on school and educational matters in 1895, I think it is. So well before the 1920 women's rights. So women were very involved and very concerned. And on almost every single board that I've looked at, there are at least 2 exceptions. Women made up at least a third of the boards.
Wow. That's really interesting. Well, I suppose we can wrap this up unless anybody else has a pressing question. But if you go to the website, I put the link in the chat to the CLIP site. If you click on contact, there's a way that you can write to Shana.
Well, I guess I didn't answer the rest of that question, Allison. So they can contact me. You know,
Okay.
We will take any kinds of documents. We can scan them. They are digitized, and then they'll be put on the website in the categories that we have. So as I said, I'm always working to work with libraries to collect more materials to increase the size of our collection.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. This has been really good, and this is a huge attendance for us. So this is a success overall. It was really interesting talk.